Well, today this is my favourite subject. This is Turkish cuisine is my favourite subject, and the confectionery is my very, very favourite subject. I've been working on it for 5 years now, particularly apart from other aspects of particularly confectionery. And of course, Turkey is very famous for its confectionery, Turkish delight. Everybody knows about Turkish delight. It's perhaps one of the most famous sweets in the whole world, probably. If you ask people which is the most well-known sweet in the world, it could well be Turkish delight, or it would be high up anyway. And one of the reasons why Turkish confectionery is so important and became so much variety and so much refinement is because of the cultural role that sweets have always played. I'm sure this is so everywhere, particularly here. Birth is particular sweets and particular drinks and particular sweet pastries were given when a child was born, eaten in celebration when people got married. They were given very, very special, beautifully produced jams and sweets and so on as gifts. You had, when the Janissaries swore allegiance to the Sultan, they presented gifts of boiled sweets called akide. And in Ramazan, the palace kitchens prepared baklava, big trays, and one tray for each of the 10 Janissaries. That was the baklava procession. And in battle, after, to commemorate the dead, a special kind of helva was made. When people die, you always make a kind of helva or lokma, which is a kind of donut, and that's still a very widespread tradition all over Anatolia today. And so it is so much a part of life. There are so many examples of this, that sweet things are very much a part of the whole life. So they're not just that people enjoy sweets or they've got a sweet tooth. By no means. It's also very much ingrained in the whole culture. And this is particularly because sugar was sugar and sweet things, of course honey as well. The sweetness is a symbol of goodness, of well-meaning feeling towards people, of kindness, of sweet talking, like the parrot is, which talks, is also very much associated with sugar because the parrot talks sweetly. And it's also even in religious significance. There's a lot of sweets are also very important on religious festivals, and so sweets have a symbolic significance of goodness and sweetness and optimism and so many things. And so they became great variety. And also, of course, the Ottoman Empire was, as an empire, was very much in touch with so many different countries which became part of the Ottoman Empire, and which was very wealthy in its heyday. All kinds of luxuries could be brought from far away, distant parts of the globe, things from India, for example. So you've got things like the the Indian gooseberry, embolan, I think, embolan, I can't remember the other name, and for exotic things like preserved ginger and so on were coming over very long distances, and similarly things from here were going to long distances. So you had the best exotic ingredients, you had local ingredients, you had people who were wealthy, and the wealthier you are, the more you care about your food, the more likely you are to get bored of what you're eating and to ask your chefs to produce something new and to expect new flavours. So things that were already known before the Ottoman Empire just peaked in an extraordinary way, like for example jam, which was, of course, marmalade was originally made of quinces. That's a Portuguese name, marmalade. That is a very old type of confection. It was made of early medieval times at least, and so it isn't that jams were unknown before the Ottoman Empire, but it's not until the 15th and especially in the 16th century that all of a sudden fruit preserves just explode. In the variety is just unbelievable, and these were taken up by Europeans first. Italy, like Nostradamus wrote a book on particularly preserves, that he learnt from Italy, and the move has always been from east to west. Really, it's only with chocolate and what sort of bonbons in the French bonbons, which are really just boiled sweets but in different colours and varieties, that the trend begins back in the other direction. Right from early medieval and even before, the sugar and sweets and sweet things always moved from east to west. And anyway, that's enough of that. But anyway, and the sugar culture, for example, is in Samarkand in the 6th or 7th century. People used to their newborn babies, they would rub sugar on their lips to ensure that they would be sweet talking. So this is a very ancient tradition of sweets and sweet things. And just to go briefly, this, according to the written records that I could get to, this is something called rock candy or rock sugar, and it's on, as you can see, it's on pieces of string. And this used to be made in Europe as well. But it is a very, very old type of sweet. It's a very interesting way of it's made, and it was the earliest record is an Arabic book about bookbinding, and this kind of sugar was an ingredient of the glue in the 11th century. So I take this to be the oldest, but who knows? It might not be the oldest type of sweet. Here it had very much a medicinal use. And it used to be made very widely in Istanbul until very recently, but now apparently Iran can make it for 5 liras a kilo, and the Turkish for 3.5 liras a kilo, so it's all imported from Iran. And the confectioners here have unfortunately in the last 10 years thrown out all their rock candy making equipment, which was valuable copper pans with holes in, and you put the strings across the pan in holes, and you put a sugar syrup in it and you bury it in a warm place wrapped in a blanket for about a week. And these crystals of sugar formed very, very pure sugar in the day when perhaps sugar refining was difficult and sugar was mainly brown sugar, except for the very, very rich who could afford to refine it 3 times. And so this sugar was very pure sugar that used by the rich. And it could be used as sweet, or it could also be a medicinal thing. So that's a very old, this is pre-Ottoman. And then there's the pulled sugar, which you can still get in sweet shops in Istanbul, and also all over Turkey too. And in England, I don't know about other countries, but in England this type of sugar, it's a bit chalky in texture. It's known as Edinburgh rock. And the story is, there's lots of stories in sweet making. The story is that a confectioner called Ferguson invented it by accident in the 19th century. But of course this isn't true, because this is one of the very, very oldest sweets. It was called faniz, from the Persian, and in Arabic called fanid, and in Europe it became penit, and several other names coming from the Arabic in Europe. And it's pulled sugar. You make a very thick sugar syrup, and then you put it onto a hook or just on a flat marble. You pull it around, and it crystallizes, and it turns white. And this is a very old form of sugar. And in the picture of the Brindisi's Amadeo Precio's picture of a sweet seller, you can see the round rings at the front of his tray. And the earliest record of this is 30th century, so it must go back a lot earlier than that. And then this is nougat on a stick. And nougat is also a very old sweet. It appears in 13th and 14th century Arabic cookery books. But in Austria it became known as Turkish Honig, which means Turkish honey. And so you can see that to Austria it went there via Turkey. And these I ordered about 3 years ago. A friend of mine did it for me. I don't know German. And she ordered them over the internet. And these are what they sell to children in fairs, this Turkish honey. Just plain nougat on a stick, it hasn't got any nuts in it. And so this is an example of how many, one of the things that went via Turkey into Europe. And this is an interesting confection called çevirme or lavuk. And it's actually exactly the same as fondant, except for the fact that it's stirred a great for a very long time in one direction, and that's apparently very important. We tried it with my friend Lalan, who's here today, and we couldn't keep on stirring it because it becomes thick, and you obviously need people with men, confectioners with very big muscles to stir it. They must have done, and it becomes a very thick, very viscous sugar confection, very smooth, and it was used to be made in many flavours, all kinds of fruit flavours, all kinds of spice flavours, and it used to be, it was actually originally lohuk, which was a medicine, type of medicine. But the whole history of sugar is because sugar is regarded as a medicinal substance, and it was still sold in pharmacies. Apparently, I think in Germany, even in the 19th century, you bought your sugar from a pharmacy. And many sweets in Turkey came from were originally medicines and were turned into sweet because they put sugar or honey in them to make them palatable to the ill person, and then gradually they left out all the medicinal substances, the herbs and the drugs, and instead replaced them with nice flavourings, and they became a sweet. And this was from lohuk. You can find recipes for lohuk in English. Culpeper, for instance, in the 17th century has recipes for it, but it never became a sweetmeat. This became a sweetmeat, and it was offered to guests. And in Greece today, it's produced commercially, and you can buy it in Turkey. It's imported, and some Turkish confectioners still produce it. Hacı Bekir, for instance. And in Greece, it's called spoon sweet, because it was eaten with a spoon. Each guest took one spoon, and instead of offering them, say you would today, let's say, a piece of Turkish delight or a chocolate, you would offer them a spoon of this really nice flavoured sweetmeat, and everybody took a spoonful. So it's known as spoon sweet in Greece. And this became fondant. It obviously went to France. It seems to have gone to France first and taken the French name, and then it went to England in the late 19th century, and it wasn't known before the second half of the 19th century. There's no record of fondant, and the first European person to write up about this lohuk was Friedrich Unger, who was the chief royal confectioner to Otto the first king of Greece. And he was a young German prince, and he was appointed as king of Greece by the European powers, and he took his chief confectioner with him, and he investigated sweets first in Greece, and then they said the place to go, you must go to Istanbul. He came to Istanbul, and he wrote a book in German, which was published in 1838. And in that book he says that he describes the lohuk, how to make it. He says it's not difficult, and he says it will be an asset. People were able to be able to make it. So either people read his book, or when he went back, he introduced it to Europe. Who knows? We'll probably never know exactly. And then it became fondant. But if you don't stir it so much, fondant, of course, has a sort of crust on the top of it. Whereas here, you not only put the lemon juice or tartaric acid to stop it crystallizing, but also it is stirred for 2 hours. Whereas fondant is slightly different in that respect, that they don't stir it so long. But anyway, that's one. And this is sherbet cakes, and it's called sat, hard sherbet, because sherbet is a fruit drink. Since people didn't drink alcohol, well, not. Of course, there was alcohol drinking going on in Ottoman times too, but very much a minority. It wasn't part of the culture, alcohol, and so people drank sherbet if they could afford them. The cheapest kinds were just honey mixed with water, but the rich people had some very sort of sophisticated, interesting, many varieties. But you couldn't get fruits all the year round, so in the season, the confectioners would say cherry season. They would make syrups out of it, ready to dilute into your sherbet, or they made these hard sort of crystallized cakes, And these would keep all the year round. So you bought these and then you diluted them in water, and lo and behold, then you had your sherbet of many different fruits at any season. Particularly Ramazan was a time for drinking these. And these were being exported into France and England from the 17th century onwards. There's records in export lists of boxes of Turkish sherbet. And in London there was a cafe called Murat's, the Great Turk's Cafe, I think it was. The Great Turk Coffee House in London. And in 1662 that was advertising that they served sherbets made in Turkey. Now obviously that would have been this. This is the only kind that you can still get in Turkey today. It's, you give it to children who have chicken pox. You give it to children with chicken pox, and also you give it to new mothers who've just given birth to give them strength. It's got what spices have? I think it's cinnamon. Cinnamon, and what's the other one? Cloves. Cinnamon and cloves is flavoured. With the red is just colouring. Perhaps in the past it was some genuine red substance, but now
also it's believed that it helps to encourage the mother to make more milk.
Oh, yes.
Or the baby.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah.
It's sweet and comforting. Anyway, you make it hot, and it's. Well, when I had my first child, we made this and we gave it to our visitors and so on. But this is the only one that's left in the past. You know, Friedrich Unger, the German chief confectioner, in his book, he gives more than 30 flavourings, and he says these are my favourites. And some were flavoured with flowers like violets, they were flavoured with fruits, they were flavoured with spices, and you had these little cakes, but they were cut, today they're just cut in these rather rough squares, but in the past they were cut in lozenges or in circles with fluted edges. That would be obviously much more elegant. And there was even a kind made with spices in it, which was, they put gold leaf on the top. So that shows, I would think that that was eaten as a sweet rather than being diluted, since you wouldn't bother to put the gold leaf on the top and then spoil it to make a drink, I don't think. And this sherbet had a very interesting influence on, I don't know whether other countries in Europe, but in England, this became a big, big favourite, this sherbet idea. And this was imported from Turkey for a long time, but then they found a substitute, which was to put make it with put carbonate of soda in it, and that made a sort of a fizzy drink. That was the beginnings of fizzy drinks. And in England we have so many sherbet sweets now that I knew from my childhood, and now you can buy them again. And one of them is this kind of sort of sherbet fountain, which has a stick of licorice in it, and this is the kind of, sort of English variety of sherbet which has carbonate of soda in it, and so when you put it in your mouth it fizzes in your mouth, and children liked that, and it generated a whole family of sweets which are really very remote from the Turkish origin. These are some that my friend from England brought me this year. There's the sherbet dabs and the cans of sherbet I didn't have in my day, but the flying saucers they were, that's rice paper filled with sherbet powder. We used to have those, and these are boiled sweets filled with sherbet, licorice sticks filled with sherbet, and then these bottles of rainbow sugar. I don't remember that from my childhood, but it's amazing how it sort of took off. And here you can only find one variety now. And now we come to Turkish Delight, which is the most famous, and this is a picture painted by Warwick Goebel, who was a very famous watercolour artist in the early 20th century. It's an illustration, it was published as an illustration in a book on Constantinople in 1906. And here you can see the confectioner at work with his fire and his stirring his Turkish Delight, and the boxes on the right. I don't know what those very big boxes are on the left. It looks maybe they were for export, great big boxes anyway, huge amounts obviously. And this is another. In England we're very clever at making very strange inventions from other people's things. And this is called Turkish Delight, but it's really disgusting actually. It's because they didn't. The reason why Turkish Delight managed to stay as Turkish Delight is actually because they made a big effort to imitate Turkish delight right since Turkish delight was first, as we know it, sort of began to be made in the late 18th century, probably by the famous confectioner Hacı Bekir, who became chief confectioner to Mahmud II in the early 19th century. And foreigners coming in the 19th century, tasted this stuff and went wild over it and described it and took it back as gifts, and it became extremely popular, and confectioners in Europe tried desperately to imitate it, but they failed miserably because the main ingredient of Turkish delight is wheat starch. Probably now it's corn starch, but it used to be wheat starch. And in Europe there's no tradition of cooking with wheat starch. Although it appears in Italian, 16th century Italian cookery book, they talk about starch. In French cookery and in British cookery, there was no, in German cookery, there was no tradition of making and using starch. That was particularly something where wheat growing began in Anatolia and the Fertile Crescent, and it was very much a part of culture in the Middle East, starch. It was used very widely and has some very special properties compared to flour. And several sweets were made with starch, and one of them's Turkish delight, and there's two older ones I'm going to go on just to mention those. And they didn't realise the jelly-like consistency of Turkish delight defeated them completely, even though Friedrich Unger had written that it was made of starch in his book in 1838, perhaps because it was published in German, and there seem to have been very few copies published. I think only one that I know of survives at all. Perhaps because of that, nobody really woke up to the fact that it was made of starch, and they just assumed it was made of gelatin. And so this horrible thing is a sort of made of, it's a horrible thick, very, very sweet red jelly enclosed in chocolate. Really nothing like Turkish delight at all, quite, but it's still popular, it's still being sold, as you can see on the internet. This is taken from the internet. And with the starch now, Friedrich Unger in his book, they don't have a word for starch in German at that period, it's evident, because he calls it hair powder, because starch wasn't used for cooking, it was used to sprinkle on your wig in the 18th, 19th, so he calls it haarpoeder. And in England, I tried to find out how much starch was used, and I looked right through Mrs. Beeton's famous 1861 cookery book, and there is no use of starch except for starching linen to stiffen it. So there was no use of starch. Funnily enough, when they started making starch from corn in America, from maize, that's when they suddenly discovered, and now we have blancmanges made with starch and sauces made with starch. Before that, they didn't use it at all. And here it was made in every home. Even quite wealthy ladies, in the summertime, you went to your summer residence your farm, and your estates, and the women would there collect the fruit, make jam, and make starch, or oversee the starch making. It was very much a home production, as well as, of course, commercial production too. It was very much, starch was very much used. And this Turkish delight became so popular that Hacı Bekir began exporting it in the middle of the 19th century to France and England. And this is a cartoon from Punch in 1861. And obviously the Turkish delight has suddenly arrived on the market, and the joke is, it's not a very funny joke actually, but this is a lady with her two children who are her lumps of delight. That's the joke, yeah. Not so funny, but anyway. And the important thing is that it really pinpoints the date of these imports. And it became extremely popular in England, but it seems that also imitations were also made. That's what we learned from another woman who came to Turkey, that she says it's so different, the real thing's so different from the imitations we eat in England. And, anyway, meanwhile, in 1870, Charles Dickens was writing his last novel, Edwin Drood, which we left unfinished. And in Edwin Drood, he takes the hero, Edwin Drood, takes his girlfriend, Rosa, to the Lumps of Delight shop. And Edwin Drood asks his girlfriend, Rosa, which way should we take Rosa? Rosa replies, I want to go to the Lumps of Delight shop. To the what? a Turkish sweetmeats, my gracious me, don't you understand anything? Call yourself an engineer and not know that. It's very sweet, isn't it? And, so it was still called, he still calls it lumps of delight, but just about then in 1873 we come across the first use of the term Turkish delight, and from then on it was largely called Turkish delight. Before that it was lumps of delight, morsels of delight. And now if we look at the history of Turkish delight, well, there's this, the main thing is the use of starch, which produces a very nice, smooth, jellyish consistency. And this sweet is called pelte. It's like blancmange, but made with water and fruit juice. And the thickening ingredient is starch. And this is a very old pudding. It was, the word pelte means smooth or refined, and it's a Persian word, but the very oldest recipe is actually a kind of made with ground almonds, some kind of pudding made with ground almonds. But very shortly after, in the 14th century, in an Arabic cookery book, it becomes a starch pudding, much as we know it today, made of grape juice and saffron. And in Turkey, this was extremely popular kind of sweet, and it was sold in the streets, and people made it at home, and it was often included almonds, made with starch and fruit juice and grape juice and so on. And you only have to make a thick version of this and stir it a bit longer, and then you get Turkish delight. So, and another link between them is actually the name, because the people who made the pelte in the 17th century, to advertise it, they used to shout, it's rahata hulku, which means ease to the throat, because it was so smooth. You know, it sort of flowed down, and the texture was so smooth, and this is also a little bit watery compared to Turkish delight, so it's smooth, went down your throat. So they called it rahata hulku, and that's what became the name of Turkish delight, because first it was called rahata hulku, and then it became known as, gradually, they shortened it to rahat loku, and then they shortened it again to lati loku in the 19th century, and then it gradually left off the lati and it became loku, which is today's name for Turkish delight. So that comes from the Arabic hulku, meaning throat actually. And this is the pelte makers in the 1582 guild procession celebrating the circumcision of Murat III's son, who was to be Mehmet III. And then there's a second ancestor of Turkish delight, which is all again made with starch. And this is something called tatlı sucuk, which, did they just bring it around?
Yes.
Yes. Oh, I wanted to, well, was actually, I've managed to find, it's made almost everywhere in Turkey. And it's a very nice thing, much better than every child ought to be given this instead of chocolate, really. It's made of nuts in the middle on strings, and then they dip it, as you can see. This is Gaziantep. The picture on the right is in Gaziantep, and they've got this rather clever contraption for doing a lot at a time. And they dip them in, leave them to dry, dip them in the boiled grape syrup, boiled up with starch, so it's thickened with the starch. And you dip it in, leave it to dry, dip it in as many times as you want. It makes a thick sausage, which is why it's called sucuk, which means sausage in Turkish. And it's made in so many places, in so many different styles, in so many different ways. And the one on the left is from the province of Malatya, which I think is very interesting, with a little sort of stick. The thing in the middle is the little stick, so you've got the double length. It was extremely long, this one. And you threaded the nuts onto your thread, usually walnuts, but it could be almonds or pistachio nuts. I don't think ever with hazelnuts for some reason. I haven't come across it, but quite possibly there is somewhere. And everyone is in quite different style, colour, and so on. So the ones I brought today was interesting because I hadn't seen it before. It was from the province of Gümüşhane in the northeast of Turkey, and it was made of mulberry syrup instead of grapes, because I don't know whether they don't have a widespread amount of cold winters. They may have many grapes, they have many mulberries, and so it's made of mulberry syrup, and it had pieces of walnut in it. I thought that was an interesting variation. Anyway, so this, because of the use of starch and the grape syrup, you can tell it's an ancestor of pelte and or a cousin of pelte and one of the ancestors of Turkish delight. And I found some interesting was that this also attracted a lot of interest from foreigners. And who travellers in the past from quite an early date. And the earliest I found was the Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta in the 14th century, and he saw it in Baalbek in Lebanon and described it as anyway, with almonds and pistachio nuts, he saw that being made there. And then in 1433, the French traveller Bertrand de Broquier, he went to a pilgrimage in the Holy Land, and he decided he wanted to see Turkey, and he travelled through the southeast of Turkey, all the way across central Turkey, and came to Istanbul, which of course then still was Byzantine. And he saw this being made in the central Turkish city of Afyonkarahisar. And he describes it in this way: they cook also a nice dish with green walnuts. Their manner is to peel them, cut them in two, and put them on a string. Then they are besprinkled with boiled wine, which attaches itself to them and forms a jelly-like paste all around them. It is a very agreeable food, especially when a person is hungry. So that takes it at least back to the 13th century, and quite possibly much earlier. Who knows how it originated, but it's definitely something, because it's not found, I haven't heard of it anywhere far from Turkey. Lebanon is the furthest. But also I think in the Balkans there are some mentions of it, presumably it went from here. And then in the 19th century we find several, like Clark, Edward Daniel Clark is 1811, he's at İğneada on the western Black Sea coast of Turkey, and he saw it, and he says, in those coffee houses may be seen groups of Turkish mariners eating a sort of sweetmeat in shape like a sausage, made of walnuts or almonds, strung upon a piece of twine, and dipped in the concocted syrup of new wine, boiled until it has acquired the consistence of a stiff jelly and bends in the hand like a piece of India rubber, which is a very good description. And then the Reverend Robert Walsh, he's in 1828, he also saw it in Çorlu, which is a city west of Istanbul, and apparently they used to manufacture it in huge quantities there. I haven't been to find out whether they still do, and it was produced commercially. Their only manufacture is a confection in great request among the Turks. It consists of walnuts enclosed in a sweet gelatinous substance made from the inspissated juice of grapes. It is formed into long cylindrical rolls like black puddings, and so transported to Constantinople, where it is eaten in great quantities. We saw some cartloads of this confection leaving the town. And sort of hurrying on just to sort of talk about, this is that famous picture by Amedeo Preziosi, and you can see the strings of sucuk hanging up on the ceiling of the shop. Some people have said this is Hacı Bekir, maybe not, who knows. But anyway, well, it certainly wasn't Hacı Bekir, because he would have been 100 years old when this picture was painted, but it could be his son, possibly. And now I go on to something called, it's called demir tatlısı in Turkish. And very interestingly, this is something shared between Europe and Turkey. Who knows where it began, really, because nobody can quite know, probably. But this is a picture from Bartolomeo Scappi's very famous cookery book. He was the cook to Pope Pius V, and this book is just a treasure. It's got these wonderful plates of kitchen equipment at the back. It's such a pity that every single country doesn't have the equivalent of Scappi. The Italians are extremely lucky. And he has an illustration of one of the irons. This was a kind of pastry. It was made with a mould. As you can see in the pan there, this mould, which is a square with holes in it, but you could make it any shape. And you made a batter with flour and beaten eggs, and you have boiling fat. You dip your mould into the boiling fat so it really heats up well, and then you dip it very gently, not right under, or else it would come off again, just halfway into the batter, and then you pop it back into the fat, and it cooks extremely quickly and pops off into the fat and goes a lovely golden colour, and then you can sprinkle sugar over it or put syrup over it, and it's very light. It's a delicious pudding. Anyway, of course, it's obviously the Italians were making it then, and he describes them as rosette irons, and he said they were made in the shapes of lions, eagles, knots, and other fanciful shapes. And curiously, he says they are called Sardinian fruit. Well, perhaps what that meant might come out somewhere, sometime. And these fritters made with moulds obviously found their way to England, and Robert May writes about them in 1685, and he gives 3 little pictures of them and calls them fritters of arms. So clearly they were being used as a kind of, perhaps a symbol for the family. And interestingly, this year I was at a symposium in Bitlis near to Lake Van, and apparently in Van, every family used to have their special design, and you distributed them to your neighbours and friends, and but they only had to look at the plate and see the design to know which lady had sent it, because each family had their own design. Well, I thought that was very interesting in connection with the fritters of arms, as if the use was also similar in Europe as well. And this is from an American catalogue, it's not dated actually, it's Walker's catalogue, but it's a hardware catalogue, published in about 1870, and they have pictures, they call them French fritter bakers. And this type obviously made with iron sheeting. They all seem to be made of iron sheeting, they're not cast, whereas the ones here used to be cast. But today in Erzurum, there's a maker, he uses the sheet metal to make them, which is cheaper and easier. But in the past they were cast from either brass or iron. Anyway, so obviously the Americans made it, but I haven't had there's a hint that somebody said I ate something similar in America, a Turkish poet actually, who said he went to America and tasted something similar, but I haven't been able to pin it down. If anybody has ever heard of something like this in America, I'd be extremely happy to hear about it. And now, and by the way, this fritters made with moulds used to be made all over Turkey, it seems. I mean, not every single province, but almost every single province. Probably, once I've sort of dug down, every single province will probably turn up to have had it. But it's been very much neglected and forgotten about, except in Erzurum it's very well remembered. And apparently in Uşak, the province of Uşak in the west of Turkey, apparently it's still made in one town. I haven't been there to find out about it yet. But in Bursa it was a very famous sweet pastry, and every house had their mould. And I went there and went around the antique shops asking about it, and most of the antique dealers hadn't even heard of the sweet, never mind know what the mould was like. And they sent me to a more older antique dealer, and he remembered them very well. And apparently everybody threw them away at the same time, nobody had any left, and they never thought anybody would be interested in them, they all went to the scrap heap. Very sad. But still, anyway, I'm hoping to bring it back. I think there's some bit more interest in last year there's been some interest. In fact, it's been shown on television and that kind of thing, and there were people interested in it before me, of course.
What was the name of it in Turkish?
In Turkish it's called demir tatlısı, iron pudding. And anyway, this is something.
Have you experimented?
Yes, I made it. I didn't. Where is the picture of it? I thought I had a picture of it actually. Oh, well, my picture's gone. I did make it,
yeah.
And because I waited 2 years. I've got some moulds, and then I waited 2 years for somebody to come and teach me, and nobody turned up offering to show me how it was done. So in the end, I just made it from a cookery book, and it works it's not that difficult. And in Erzurum, I asked for it because that's the place where it really has survived on a big scale. And I went to the restaurants. I said, "Well, I want to taste demir tatlısı." And they said, "Oh, but that's a home dish." And I said, "Yes, a home dish, but you have tourists, and wouldn't they like to taste it?" "Oh no, it's a home dish." They couldn't. It was a home dish, and that was it. You couldn't make it in a restaurant. But actually, it's not difficult.
Why didn't you ask them to take you to their home?
Yeah, I found a lady. I was there very briefly for a conference about a completely different subject. But I met a lady in a carpet shop, and a middle-aged lady, and I asked her about it, and she was just moving house. She couldn't And then I asked several other people. I said, would you just ask your mother to take a photograph? But nobody could be bothered. It didn't work out. If I'd gone there a bit longer, I could have found, because everybody's making it.
Next time.
Next time.
Push
Yes.
them hard.
Yes. Well, I met a lady in Bitlis from Erzurum. She's a very interesting lady. She owns a newspaper in Erzurum, and she has an old one. Anyway, this is another thing, maybe. So I'm going on a bit quickly because it will be too late. And keep you too long from your tea. And then this is called. These are wafers, and this was a shared European and Middle Eastern thing. But when it began, who began it? And it has a very long history in Europe, especially as a religious, the wafers used in the Catholic Church. Apparently the Orthodox Church didn't have the idea of the unleavened bread. That's what Alan Davidson explains about this. And he tells us that the oldest wafer arm was discovered in an excavation at Carthage, and this wafer arm dates from the 6th or 7th century. So that shows just how old it is, at least 1,400 years old. Really an old kind of pastry. And this is a page from a prayer book in the Bodleian Library, and it's a Flemish prayer book, a Flemish manuscript, and there's a little picture of a lady making wafers in the fire. She's sort of holding it the wrong way around with the handles in the fire, and that's because she's finished making her wafer and she's removing it and holding it up. So that's very interesting. And then the other wafer arms are from Diderot's famous encyclopedia. One's more like a waffle iron, actually. In Turkey, I don't know how old it is. It may be something that arrived later. I've no idea. It could be. It was a big thing in Istanbul. My friend Stephanie remembers it from when you had wasn't it in Beşiktaş?
Yes, 1970.
1970. So it was really still going strong then. But since then, everybody's again sort of been thrown out, forgotten. We have those horrible tasteless wafers that they sell in the street in the circles in the cellophane packages, which, please, they're so tasteless. Apparently the real thing is like a waffle, a very thin waffle, and very tasty, of course. And they used to be filled with soft nougat, usually, in Turkey. And they were called paper helva. And this is a wafer iron from Topkapı Palace. You can see it, except I think the kitchens are closed at the moment for reorganisation. But they've had 3 or 4 hanging on the wall there. One very small one and 3 bigger ones. And this is another example. It's very nice. They're very big and very heavy. They weigh about 8 or 9 kilos. They're extremely heavy. And you open them up. That has a picture. This one dates from 1931, and it's got the name of the maker on it. One side it has a picture of a ship, and the other side it has a picture of a bird. And there's the picture. It got muddled up. Anyway, got in the wrong place somehow. Anyway, and that's the places that, so far as I know, well, I've determined that it is actually. It used to be made, at least, not perhaps today, but it used to be made until a generation ago, at least, in those provinces. So you look at the distribution from the east, going right to the west. For sure it was made in most of the provinces in Turkey in the past. It just needs digging up. Anyway, these are also the, sorry, I'm not having to skip now because my pictures got all muddled up. This is the demir tatlısı irons, but none of them are very old. Although they're cast, they're definitely not, I think they're not more than perhaps 40 years old, 30 at the most. That one of a butterfly at the bottom right, that's from Syria. Eileen Tan bought that from Syria. She sent me that photo. The other ones are from Turkey, but the person I bought them from didn't really know which province they came from. They just turn up. Now this is the next subject. These sort of lollipops that in Turkey they call horoz şekeri or kokurul sweets. And these again have disappeared over the last sort of 10, 15 years and have made in very few places now. And in the 19th century they used to be made in England apparently. They're described by a confectioner called Scoops, who wrote a book on the art of confectionery in 1881, and he calls them, hold on, what does he call them? He calls them boiled sugar figures, and says, Iron moulds are made by confections machinists for casting boiled sugars in. They maybe had to turn out all kinds of figures such as dogs, cats, elephants, etc., etc. They are very popular amongst the children and sell well in certain districts and show a handsome profit. And he describes how they make them, which you have a double mould, as you can see in the bottom. You have a double mould and you hold them together, grease it, pour the boiling sugar in, and then immediately turn it out, and it leaves just a shell. So there isn't an awful lot of sugar in them. They're hollow, they're very brittle, very fragile, and they stick them on a stick, and then they used to sell them in the streets. And some of them, there's lots and lots of different moulds. I've seen quite a lot now. Birds, animals, donkeys, cars, trains, balloons, baskets, all kinds of shapes, but always the cockerel has been the big favourite apparently with children. And some of them whistled. And I haven't found a whistle mould.
I remember from my childhood.
Yeah.
You know, we used to whistle.
Yeah, but I haven't been able to find a mould that's a whistle mould. Although somebody recently said that they just made the whistle separately and stuck it on because they had sugar whistles as well. But then I talked to Nurtekin Erol, the confectioner, and he says no, it was definitely incorporated in them. It shouldn't have just been stuck on. So anyway, that's still something to be discovered. This is a whistle mould. It's for making 5 whistles. It's about that big, the real thing. And this is one of the very last lollipop makers, the traditional lollipop makers. He's called Ibrahim Denizci. He's a Romani. He lives in Bergama. It's still his living. He also sells ice cream in the summer. And he and his wife make them. And he goes around the streets selling them, and also he takes them to weddings, and that's really the reason why they've survived in Bergama, because it's a tradition to buy the children a lollipop at weddings. Thank goodness. And he says really they're not that bothered about them. Everybody would prefer a chocolate bar, but because it's a tradition, the mothers have to buy one of the lollipops for their children. So luckily he's managed to keep on this, and he makes them, and he made a lot for me and to photograph. And this is keten helvası, or pişmaniye, which there was some on the table for tea, and
it was delicious. Thank you.
Yes, but Juliana went and bought it or sent for it. And yeah, it is absolutely delicious. I think if I had to choose one Turkish sweet that I can do, that's this one. And it's really, really nice. It's in very, very fine gossamer threads. And apparently they also make this in Iran. And it used to be made, not by confectioners, funnily enough, but at home. And this is one of the last families who are still making it at home. It's the Beren family in Kastamonu. And his grandson took these photographs for me. This is his grandfather pulling the sugar, and it is extremely difficult to make. All the old recipes say we're describing it, but there's no way, don't even bother to try, and then you can sit down and be taught it by somebody. And it was a virtuoso performance that people did in their homes in the winter when they invited guests. When it was cold, you invited your guest, you had nothing else to do, and that was a social time in the winter. And the men who were good at making it showed off, I think, really. And then you can see he's really enjoying showing off. It's not easy to make sugar syrup and to pull it. Working with sugar is always an art. You mustn't boil it too much or too little. And the women, I think, used to do the job of roasting the flour in butter, which is the other ingredient, which are then combined. And it's very interesting. All over Turkey, people were doing this, which is so difficult to do. I think that's really incredible. And it had so many sort of specific little points that you had to obey if you wanted it to work. Like you always waited for it to be extremely cold weather, when preferably there was snow outside, because the sugar, when you're working it, which I'll show in the next picture, this is them working the rope of sugar into the roasted flour butter, and if you, as their hands work it, they gradually stretch it each time larger and larger until it gets to the size of the tray, and then they make it into a figure of 8 and start again. That's how the little threads form, because you make your ring smaller by making the figure of 8, so you get 2 strands. You do it again, 4 strands, 6, 8, then it becomes 8, 16, 32, up to 1,024, I think, if you do it 16 times, and then you get those very, very, very, very thin threads like hair. And of course it got hot while you're working it, and you had to keep putting your tray out in the snow. That shows how difficult it was to make this. You know, you can't make it in hot weather.
How long would the whole process have taken?
Well, I haven't watched it myself, but I think at least 2 hours. Yeah, but I hope this winter somebody's invited me to go and watch a family making it in Bolu. I would have loved to watch them, but I haven't been able to go. Yeah, I think 2 hours. Well, if you think of roasting the flour and then making your sugar syrup, maybe even 3 perhaps, and then everybody ate it with a cup of tea, and that was your refreshment for your visitors. And so everybody had fun making it, and while they were making it, people used to sing songs and tell jokes and play parlour games, and those evenings get-togethers were called helva sohbeti, and that was the main Turkish social life. They didn't have balls or, you know, sort of public sort of concerts in the same way. Your social life was at home, and you had these helva conversations, helva get-togethers. And you made helva, you invited your friends and neighbours, and you had fun, and everybody contributed, and you made jokes, and you had forfeits in complicated parlour games. I think I would have preferred that to television, actually. I would like to have done such a thing. It was very nice. Of course, that's why it's disappearing, because people don't, everybody's got a television now. And that's the finished product they're showing. That's Mehmet Bey's son, and that's his daughter-in-law. That's his wife, and that's their daughter-in-law, I think, or their daughter. And that's then you press it into the tray and cut it into lozenges. And now the last thing is jam. And well, I said this at the beginning actually, so I don't have to go into it. You know, the variety was just exploded in the 16th century, and it became real expert. And jam wasn't something you just spread on your bread for breakfast, as it is today, because jam was a luxury. It was beautifully made. It was like a liqueur chocolate in status today. You offered it to your friends. You didn't drink the syrup. The syrup you would make into sherbet. It was the pieces, so they were beautifully made. Like you have, I don't know if any of you have ever eaten citrus peel jam made of bergamot or made of citrons here, and they roll them, and they cut them into strips, and you sew them into these neat little rolls, and you make your jam that way. Or you make your green figs, and you perhaps decorate them with pieces of orange peel. I mean, they should be beautifully made, beautifully presented, and there's something to take pleasure out of, and you don't sit down and gobble a lot of it. You just have one and enjoy that. And they were something precious that they spent a lot of time over. Sugar was expensive, they were time consuming, and they were something very special. We've somehow lost the idea that jam is of any importance, because manufactured jam is so cheap now. And they didn't use, anyway, this, just briefly, those are 2 jars for juju jam and apricot jam from Sagbekhanı Museum. And this is a grater for making grated quince jam, which was a very popular type. It's an old grater specifically for that. And Friedrich Unger describes this as a jam machine, which is interesting, and he described it in 2 or 3 sentences separately. So it shows that, I mean, this was a grater of a type they didn't have in Europe at that time. And this other picture on the right, that's a chap at the palace, one of the pages, holding a pot of jam to present to the Sultan, presumably. It's a picture from Huraca Dawson's book about the Ottoman Empire, written in the 18th century. And this is a set that you would offer your guests jam with. And you have this set. In fact, the forks are a later sort of westernized sort of influence. In fact, you always had spoons. This is a later example. And so your guest took one of the spoons, or perhaps if it was, say, a fig, you could stick your fork into it as well, or you took a spoonful of your jam or your fondant that I showed earlier. And anyway, just to finish off, this is a 16th century shop with sugar loaves, sweet chalk, and the parrot showing, because the parrot was a very symbolic. I don't know whether it's a. I assume that it's a real parrot, and perhaps it had a perhaps it was sort of like the symbol of the confectioners, because it comes up so often in poetry that parrots love sugar and that they taught. And this is again from the 1582 in they're parading figures made of sugar, all kinds of animals made of sugar, and of course that's it. Thank you.